important it is to deploy capital from the DFIs to build these projects. And my next panel is looking to discuss just that. So essentially, this particular panel is looking at DFIs and how we can make green hydrogen banks bankable. Basically, the COP26 agreement urges the operating entities of the financial mechanism, multilateral development banks, and other financial institutions to further scale up investments in climate action. 6 months on from COP26, how are the development finance actors tackling the bankability of green hydrogen projects? And we'll talk about that in some details. Namibia was an interesting example and others as well. So this particular panel gives insights into plans and projects by key development finance institutions in the green hydrogen industry and opportunities ahead. It aims to understand key concerns and challenges faced by development finance institutions considering green hydrogen investments and identify the actions needed to scale up green hydrogen investments, in particular in emerging economies. So join me as we welcome Sir Danny Alexander, the Vice President of the Asian Infrastructure Bank. He should be joining us by video and he will not be able to make it, but we've got Tonchi Bankovic, the Chief Energy Specialist from the IFC. Thanks for making it, sir. We look forward to a great conversation. François Gilles, Innovation Finance Advisor from the European Investment Bank. We're definitely having conversations with them as well. Gian Piero Naci, Director Sustainable Business and Infrastructure from the EBRD. And then, of course, Lisa Fisher, Program Leader at the E3G. And I look forward to your conversation. So as I move to come and join you guys on the couches, my sort of introductory questions to each of you is the following. So you each get about 2 minutes to talk about these. For the development banks, what is your 2-minute pitch on what your organization is doing to scale up investments in green hydrogen? And then for E3G in particular, what are some of the lessons from your work on sustainable finance and climate for development finance institutions planning green hydrogen investments? So we just got a video actually from Danny Alexander that he will be playing on the screen, and after that, please let's get into the questions. So can we set up that video?
It's a great pleasure for the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank to be part of today's gathering at the Green Hydrogen Global Assembly. And for me, as Vice President responsible for policy and strategy in the bank, I'm delighted to be here. And I would like to extend my thanks and gratitude to the Green Hydrogen Organization for inviting me to take part in this session. And I'm delighted to see that so many of our fellow multilateral development banks are here to share insights and experiences and are ready to collaborate on this important topic. The world is at a critical crossroads to set the trajectory of carbon emissions reduction and act on our climate commitments. As we saw from the recently released report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, without immediate and deep reductions in emissions across all sectors, Paris Agreement goals will be beyond reach. In Glasgow last year, we saw the Glasgow Climate Pact and a clear commitment to aim to keep the goal of temperature rises to 1.5 degrees within reach. AIB is playing its role in this. We have committed that by 2025, at least 50% of our investments will be for climate change mitigation and adaptation. And we've also committed that by the middle of 2023, all of our new investments will be aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement. We think that over the course of this decade, AIB will deploy at least $50 billion for climate finance in that period. While the decarbonization of the power sector is well underway, decarbonization of hard-to-abate sectors such as long-haul transportation, industry, and heating is still at an early stage and hinges on commercialization of new technologies, such as green hydrogen at scale. DFIs and multilateral development banks, like the AIB, have been key enablers of solar and wind adoption in the past. I believe we can play a similar enabling role to support green hydrogen, utilizing the variety of tools that we have at our disposal. AIB's members include those that enjoy the most abundant renewable energy resources and are positioning themselves to be future green hydrogen production and export hubs, as well as members which are pioneering hydrogen applications. We have received financing requests to the AIB in both areas, which we're actively considering. As with, I think, many organizations, we're in the process of learning and developing our approach for supporting hydrogen. So far, we're taking a very practical approach. We're going up the learning curve by devoting resources to projects that are proposed to us and learning from those projects and learning from their implementation. Furthermore, based on our experiences in promoting infrastructure technology, we believe it is as critical to support the development of technology as it is to support its adoption at the project level. Therefore, apart from financing hydrogen projects, we will also be looking to deploy risk capital with a view to removing technological bottlenecks and reducing costs along the hydrogen value chain. As an example, AIB recently approved a $50 million financing to the Neo Venture Capital Fund, which focuses on decarbonization and digitalization technologies in the transport and energy value chains. Making green hydrogen bankable will require concerted efforts from all stakeholders, especially to get the costs of green hydrogen to the point where they can be truly competitive. Incentives from governments, long-term offtake agreements are important elements of successful hydrogen projects and what we will be looking for in the future as we seek to scale up this sector. So with that, let me again share my appreciation for the efforts of the Green Hydrogen Organization to bring us all together today. We look forward to more exchanges and collaboration in the future with all the participants at today's event, and we look forward to playing a role in helping green hydrogen to be one of the technologies that can help the world reach the climate goals that we have set out. Thank you very much indeed, and good luck with the conference.
Brilliant. Fantastic. So that was Sir Danny Alexander, Vice President of the AIIB. So Tonchi, why don't we perhaps start with you? That was his 2-minute pitch. What would you tell us about what the IFC is doing? And please feel free to use any projects in the pipeline or any funding commitments that the IFC has to support green hydrogen. Over to you.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Good. You heard all throughout this morning that the IPCC, the Panel on Climate Change, has said that we have 5 to 7 more years to go before the point of no return, 1.5 degrees centigrade. So at IFC, we are true believers that we don't have time to do studies. We have to do projects. And we have created an upstream team. We call it pre-investment team to take co-development risk with the private sector. This team has been deployed 2 years ago. They already have 10 green hydrogen projects worldwide, 4 in Latin America, 4 in the Middle East, North Africa, and 2 in the southern part of Africa. These projects are wonderful projects. Especially the ones in Latin America have the 4 out of 5 prerequisites you need for the $2 a kilogram hydrogen. One of them is extremely cheap electricity prices. Latin America, the last auction in Chile was 1.3 cents for solar. Mexico was 1.8 cents. The grid in Brazil is 2.6 cents. The grid power in Colombia is 2.6 cents. So in addition to cheap electricity, these countries have 24/7 power. So the utilization of your electrolyzer, which is the second condition to have cheap hydrogen, is above 75%. Because when you don't have wind, you have solar. When you don't have solar, you have hydro. So it's really nice. Then they also have land and they have water. So they have 4 of the 5 key requirements to reach $2 a kilogram hydrogen. We're only missing one ingredient, and it is the cost of the electrolyzers. They're expensive, they're difficult to get, and that's where I need help. And that's why we're working very hard on trying to get blended finance to these 10 hydrogen projects we have, because without blended finance, they will not happen. We are also working on the offtake. We've been in dialogue with the GH2 Global, the German initiative to guarantee the offtake of green hydrogen projects, green ammonia, methanol, green jet fuel. And we have our own guarantee scheme. The World Bank has the partial risk guarantee. We've guaranteed large auctions of renewables in Argentina, 4,500 megawatts, where we guarantee the offtake. We are also working with the credit export agencies because they're key in order to deploy these new technologies to emerging markets. And we are working very, very hard to try to get that concessional money and the license to work in mid-income countries. Because, you know, in order to scale up green hydrogen, you need to get started in the mid-income countries to get the scale. And so that's what we are doing in parallel, where we are already putting money at risk in projects, and we have teams co-developing together with the private sector. That's what we are doing in terms of green hydrogen at IFC.
That's brilliant. And I hope some of the government officials in the room are taking down notes. Francois Gilles, you work at the EIB, and your title is Innovation Finance Advisor. So what's the EIB doing to help this particular item move along?
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Indeed, I'm part of our advisory services. We're basically a point of origination, point of entry for projects into the EIB ecosystem, and we focus on providing support to promoters to find their way to the bank solutions. Now, just a word, I think with some hopefully humility, I'll start with what we perhaps are not doing, or at least what's a bit outside of our remit is, you know, we cannot effectively make projects bankable. Financing, in effect, does not make a project bankable. Fundamentals make projects bankable. With that said, what we are doing, I would start with first using our balance sheet. We're using our balance sheets year in, year out to finance approximately in the order of 4 billion euros worth of renewable infrastructure across the world. That, I think, has been rightly said, is one of the key enablers for hydrogen in the next decades. We're also using our balance sheet to support further innovation and investment in hydrogen already today, admittedly with some large corporate partners, large corporate clients, for example, to support their R&D investment plans in relation to hydrogen, like we did for Halde Topsoe earlier this year, or to finance actual deployment of hydrogen projects, like we did with Iberdrola just a few weeks ago. No, that's the first thing. A second thing we're doing is that we've now had for several years really useful instruments that allow us to take a high risk capacity, a high risk exposure into the projects we support. These projects, these instruments are very well suited to support hydrogen deployment, in particular where they are sort of residual risks that would otherwise make it too difficult for a bank to come in. We have used these instruments, for example, to support Everfuel in the hydrogen mobility sector a couple of years ago, or Elcogen, a fuel cell developer in Estonia. And there's much more that can be done. These tools have been further reinforced under InvestEU, our programming a framework mandate for the next 7 years, and we were very much working to identify a pipeline of projects to deploy these higher risk instruments that we have. And then the last thing I would say that we're doing more in the intangible front, and sort of where I come from, is we're providing in-kind support, so advisory support to project promoters to, let's say, crack development questions that they may have, to assist in the preparation of their financing applications, to assist in the financing structuring of their projects, And just by way of example, to make this as tangible as possible, where we recently issued a call for expressions of interest through our partners at the European Commission, a call to the members of the Clean Hydrogen Alliance to come and talk to us. And within a week or so, we received expressions from over 30 projects worth over 5 billion euros worth in terms of investments. And some of these projects we were not yet in touch with. So there's so much that needs to be done to engage early, to identify the issues, because obviously we all know there are issues, and hopefully collectively find solutions to those. Thank you.
That's amazing. 30 projects, 5 billion. That's a pretty big number. Gianpiero, what's the EBRD doing from your side?
Thank you very much, James. First of all, a small introduction about EBRD. We are a multilateral development bank. We operate in former Soviet Union, East Europe, and the Mediterranean, the Middle East. So we cover an area which in fact has a lot of potential for green hydrogen and green feedstock. We invest approximately 10 billion euro per annum across over 400 projects, primarily in the private sector. So 75% of our annual portfolio is in the private sector. And about half of this amount is in green projects. So clearly we have a strong emphasis and strong focus on climate investments and green investments. So hydrogen clearly play a big role. Now, we do work with a strong focus on the private sector. So in a way, the words of the colleagues of the FC resonates, very much with our model. In fact, sometimes we compete, but often we cooperate. But maybe to complement, and we are now looking at a number of industrial scale, green hydrogen projects, particularly in North Africa. But I would like to perhaps give another dimension, which in my view is very important. It's about the long-term sustainability of these investments. So the importance of creating what we always say, the enabling environment. I know it's a bit of an abuse expression, but ultimately is absolutely important. And one example is creating for the capacity at the country level to scale up renewable energy. One example is Egypt. Actually, we cooperated a lot with the FC to create the environment for the regulation for renewable energy auctioning. And this is really how to create the room for large-scale solar projects in the country. Remaining in Egypt, just as an example, the work in creating the right, if you like, platforms to facilitate investments and align the interest of, let's say, project developers, policymakers, regulators, but crucially the investors, is also working on the right type of analysis. One example we've done recently, we launched last year at the COP, a study actually with the IEA, I see Paolo in the audience, with the International Energy Agency and International Fertilizer Association on a global roadmap for decarbonization of the nitrogen fertilizer industry, which of course, is very much centered around, green ammonia, green hydrogen. This work, really gives strong indication to the investors about what are the technologies needed and when investments are required. But now we're doing a deep dive in Egypt, really to look at what are the opportunities in the country, together with the local fertilizer association, government institution, and again, looking at also the financial sector. So we think that these type of platforms are absolutely relevant to scale up the investment, but also sustain long-term sustainability in the financial market. Final example in terms of this importance of this strategic work is also making sure that these activities are connected with the, let's say, country level, sectoral level, long-term decarbonization and transition to low carbon economy. So it's very important that we do this work in connections with the country level, NDC commitments and ambition, but more importantly, long-term strategy at the sectoral level. And then perhaps later I can also dwell a bit on what we bring, I think, as international financial institutions to the global investors in this space. Thank you.
Brilliant. So we've now heard from all the development finance institutions. So Lisa, you're part of a think tank really at the forefront of this particular subject matter. So what are some of the lessons from your work on sustainable finance and climate from development finance institutions that you would love to share with us today?
Thank you very much. And I hope you can hear me all. It's been fascinating to also listen to your contributions. Maybe just for background, at E3G, we've been for years now engaging with development finance institutions around their Paris alignment process. And we're very keen to also do that now in the context of hydrogen. My colleague Sonia Dunlop's been engaging very much. I head up our work on energy systems. And so really the tricky questions on how can we get to net zero in our energy systems. I was thinking before coming here, why are we all here? Yeah, probably for very different motivations. Some of us, it's about the climate. Some of us, it's about the development challenge and the role hydrogen can play in there. Some of us, it's really about transforming economies to be using, I think we heard earlier about leapfrogging, to be using really the most modern technologies and going forward. And it's within that spirit that I was thinking I want to comment on sort of how do we do that in the context of hydrogen. We've got more urgency now with the Russian invasion in Ukraine to really deliver the green transition fast and well. But what does that mean for investments in hydrogen, especially in the developing country context? And we're about to actually publish 7 principles around hydrogen finance for development finance institutions. So happy to share them later. But I wanted to hear what people have to say here first before we finalize them. But just to give you a bit of flavor, some of the things we're thinking about is it really starts already before you select your project to do hydrogen well and to do it fast. It's really about making sure, and John Biero just mentioned it, making sure it's part of a broader strategy for what we're using that hydrogen for. We've seen earlier that within the next 5 to 10 years, hydrogen really needs to be used to replace gray hydrogen. So renewable hydrogen needs to be used to replace gray hydrogen if we want to really get a big climate return for our investments. I think that's also in the context of the IEA numbers that we want to achieve peak gas demand by 2025. So we really need to focus on where can we get the biggest climate return for our money. Second, there's also something about that broader industrial strategy. I think one idea is obviously exporting hydrogen or using hydrogen for export. But then we are, again, exposed to volatility on global markets. Hydrogen is much lower return or lower margins than fossil fuel exports, for example. So it's even more important to embed that into a strategy around ancillary industries, fertilizer production, and so on and so forth, especially to mitigate for other regulatory risk like carbon border adjustment mechanisms and so on. So I think it's really important for development finance institutions to also embed hydrogen within that broader context. And then obviously, I think I'm preaching to the converted here, but renewable hydrogen is what has the long-term future here. And so we need to think about hydrogen as a function of the electricity grid. And when it comes to development finance institutions, don't leave all the hydrogen planning to the gas people. Make sure we think about it as something that is supporting the electricity grid, that is sort of part of the planning around electricity. Only then we're really able to disrupt. And then second, once we've used this context to really select the right hydrogen projects, then I think it's really about the project design. And just a couple of short comments here, but what we want to make sure is that we increase chances of success. We've got urgency, we want to do it well, we want to minimize failure. And so it's incredibly important to secure, for example, end use early on and not sort of produce hydrogen and find out later we don't actually need it. But also to secure, and this come up a lot, secure the supply chain further up. So the renewables, we need to do that. And I know the European Hydrogen Strategy quotes 40 gigawatts of electrolyzers by 2030 in North Africa and Ukraine. Only 30% of the renewables needed to do that have been installed to date or as of last year, and that's assuming they're not using any of that electricity domestically. So it is really securing that renewables upstream that is so critical. Otherwise we're setting ourselves up for failure. All those countries end up exporting the hydrogen, but then facing again the CBAM penalty on the electricity they want to export. So it's really important to bear that in mind. And then we've also seen, especially when it's about midstream investments, so not hydrogen production, but perhaps pipelines, converting pipelines, or also end use, investing in end use appliances. It's really also important to make sure the hydrogen will actually materialize. That's going to be fueling those end use appliances. Otherwise, these these investments will also become stranded. And that again just highlights it's really important to make this part of a broader strategic assessment of the energy system, but also of the economic transformation strategy. I'll leave it here. Thank you.
Fantastic. I mean, really, really good advice. Making sure that hydrogen planning is not being done in isolation, for example, stands out for me, and making sure that it's part of a decarbonization agenda for that country as well, not just for exports, is another item that stands out for me. So Gilles, you said something that really sort of caught my attention. You said hydrogen is not going to be made bankable by capital provision. Essentially, the fundamentals matter. So what key challenges do you see in the fundamentals from making green hydrogen bankable, if at all? And what sort of advice would you give to governments, private sector developers, and potential off-takers?
Tough question, but I mean, I think a few things were mentioned earlier today: thermodynamics, efficiency questions, which obviously tie directly into the economics that projects present to investors. This is further complicated, obviously, by the regulatory context. Perhaps not all policies are, yet fully supportive of green hydrogen as we would wish they were. And in particular, from the standpoint of investors, we hear from our work with investors of the need to make sure that avoided carbon emissions are that there's a way to monetize that and reflect that in sort of business plans and financing decisions. So all that, I suppose, is still a work in progress. Now, perhaps more concretely, when it comes to financing, what assuming this is solved for rather quickly, that projects are, let's say, economic enough for investors to decide to pour in equity into them. It's still likely that there'll be what we call deployment risks or residual risks that might make it difficult for lenders to come in with cheap low-cost project financing on a standalone basis, like most project promoters are, which is what most project promoters are seeking. So to help to support in this, against these residual risks, I think this is where tools like those I mentioned earlier that have a degree of risk absorption capacity, risk-taking capacity, can make a difference. And basically take exposure to these risks, whether it's offtake or technology performance, maintenance uncertainty, asset life uncertainty, these types of considerations, and ensure that financing can be deployed in support of these projects, and then consequently that a track record is built, which would then sort of help mainstream the notion of investment into hydrogen deployment.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for that. So Tonchi, to follow on this question, you made an interesting comment earlier. You said, in Latin America specifically, they sort of have 4 out of the 5 key items they really needed to get, green hydrogen produced at $2 or less. And the item that you mentioned there was, you said, electrolyzers, right? So, question is, what is holding development finance institutions such as yours from investing in green hydrogen projects in emerging markets? If it's electrolyzers, how are you moving with the developers and/or those countries to get electrolyzers pumped into South America and really get that production going?
Well, end of this month, I'm going to Germany to ask for donor money. It's very hard to compete within the World Bank for donor money when you are competing with health education in very poor countries. I know that climate is not a local issue, it's not a regional issue, it's a global issue. We all need to hurry up. We are running out of time. It's also important. But we also deal with poverty. So I'm competing with donor money for climate issues, and I need help. We did this 10 years ago, 15 years, 20 years ago with wind and solar. We invested when nobody was investing, and that's what we call first mover disadvantage. We lost a lot of money with feed-in tariffs in Eastern Europe, with merchant solar in the Atacama Desert in Chile, but we made it happen. So it's our role to be the first mover, to take the first mover risk. But for wind and solar, we were able to get this concessional money to do the blended finance. To me, today, this is the challenge I have myself. On those 10 projects I was talking about, the challenge is to get the blended finance. Without blended finance, they will not happen. So I need that little push. The demand, I'm not worried, because a lot of these countries, they also have their local demand. It's amazing that countries, for example, like Brazil, they import ammonia to produce fertilizers in a country that has huge agriculture. And today may be the bed basket of the world, because Russia is at war, Ukraine is at war, India is not exporting food, and Brazil needs to import ammonia at $1,000 a ton, when they could be producing green ammonia at home with hydro, solar, and wind. So that the little help, we only need help with electrolyzers. And well, my office in Beijing tells me that the Chinese may have it at $400 a kW. You know, the electrolyzers we're looking at right now, the Americans, Europeans are at $1,600 a kW. But for me, for my projects, if I can get electrolyzer at $800 a kW, electricity at 2 cents a kilowatt hour, and I can have a utilization factor above 75%, that's it. It's bankable. So I have, of those 3, I have 2 of the conditions. I'm only missing the electrolyzer one. I need help with that.
That is fantastic specificity, Gian Piero. So, what are the main then sort of actions, right, that development finance institutions should be prioritizing to make projects bankable? Tonchi knows exactly what he needs. Electrolyzers at $800 a kilowatt. So, from your side, what should we be doing?
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe just adding one extra point, because also what we see is the structure of the sort of the investments we are looking at the moment, and particularly when it comes to bankability, we need, apart from all the conditions just raised now, there is the element of the long-term sort of PPA type of elements. Clearly, this is what I guess we're struggling to see in the market at the moment. So it's not necessarily, the capital cost is an issue by all means, but the absence of long-term offtake agreement is often what makes the bankability of these investments difficult. The other element is also to connect better and in a more structured way the global capital. So when we have, for example, renewable energy projects in most of our region, we typically don't struggle to find capital, because there is a lot of money out there that is looking for a green home, right? The problem though is with green hydrogen is the fact that, let's say, there is still I don't want to say distorted, but to an extent asymmetric sort of aspiration or in terms of the return on the investments from the global capital, and this is often a problem. What we bring to the table as MDBs and DFIs is ultimately a very strong risk management discipline. We often offtake all the due diligence cost, so we bring a lot to the table. But going back to your question, I go back to my point previously, is about really creating. Let's say green hydrogen investments don't happen in a vacuum. They have to be embedded and included and considered in a broader context. So it's important to look, for example, at the capacity of the grid to absorb more renewable energy. It's important to apply the standards. We talked about standards this morning. Tomorrow, we're all waiting for the EU to come up with specific standards on green hydrogen. This is going to be quite important impact, at least on the region where the EBRD operates. So is all these elements together that needs to be taken into account. It's not necessarily one specific element.
Brilliant. So, Lisa, Gian Piero is talking about a portfolio of items that need to happen. As governments, we're like, can you please translate all of that? how can development finance institutions maximize their impact, right? They have a lot of things that they can do to get these projects going. So in terms of selecting green hydrogen investments and really getting the capital deployed so we can get going, how would you summarize all of that advice to governments and developers, but also to DFIs and MDBs?
Yeah, thanks. And actually, I have a question back to you. Maybe we can pick it up on the panel or later, but I'd be very interested in how you're sourcing your projects at the moment, right? How do they come to you? And how are they being selected? Because that goes back to the point that I made previously, and I think I'm just going to make again. It obviously needs to be part of a broader strategy, and it's incredibly important that, as just quoting Giampiero now, but that hydrogen investments don't happen in a vacuum. But I wanted to pick up something as well, Tonto, you said, is sort of, we don't want to be in a world where we're competing for capital for clean energy or competing vis-a-vis other important public purposes, social outcomes, development outcomes, and so on and so forth. And this year is, I just wanted to say that the bigger picture, this year is really a crunch point where we need the G7, we need them to mobilize more capital. And I think we have the political backdrop to that. Is also, especially with hydrogen, but also with other clean energy investments that are critical to easing pressure on global gas markets, that are critical for global energy security, for global multilateral cooperation. So I just wanted to say that here in this context as well, that we must repeat that expectation towards governments and decision makers in the global north. But then I wanted to, in terms of recommendations, just very practically, the one thing that no one's mentioned, and that might be a bit of a surprise, is do energy efficiency at home, because it'll free up a lot of resource for producing, first for electrifying a lot of end users, but also then for producing hydrogen to decarbonize your industry. Then obviously, we've heard that, do renewables, then obviously make sure it's part of an industrial strategy. So you use that as sort of long-term, building long-term resilience of your exports rather than just commodity exports. And then finally, hydrogen will be a precious resource. Don't waste it. Don't blend it into the grid, into the gas grid. I think that's where it has least added value. So I just wanted to kind of come back to one very basic point here in terms of advice. Thank you.
So before taking away from you, where should we be putting it if not in the gas grid? I mean, we heard this morning that steel might be one of the most efficient uses for hydrogen. So where should we be deploying hydrogen?
Yeah, so industry, generally speaking, needs 100% hydrogen, so not blended. So that's the distinction I'm trying to make here. If you blend it into the grid, you just basically drive up the price of the natural gas there and make it less pure, and you're not able to use it, or you have to deblend it at the end point. So again, that brings you back to also the conversation we had around off-taker risk. The closer you embed it into a strategy of already talking to your industrial end user, and ideally produce the hydrogen as close as possible to where you're going to use it, the more you minimize the costs around it, the more you minimize the off-taker risk, and so on and so forth.
Brilliant, fantastic. So the audience, thank you so much for hanging about and paying attention. I'd love to bring you in at this point in time. So if any of you have a question for our esteemed panel, please do raise your hand. We're going to try and get a mic to you. And then I'd love for you to introduce yourself and ask your question. And I do see that we have actually quite a few questions hanging out over here. Do we have anyone that can get a mic to our audience? There's our mic coming. And we'll take the gentleman here on the second row for our first question. So feel free to introduce yourself and then, of course, ask your question. And if you can, direct it to any one of the panelists that you would like to answer. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot for the interventions and all the great insight. It will not be directed to any of you, sorry for that, so it will be more general, but we talked a lot about the importance of off-takers to have a bankable project. And I was wondering, okay, we know there are all those big companies that are basically directly making partnerships with off-takers and building the projects with them from the starts. But we know that we'll need more projects than those big gigawatt projects with big companies. And so SMEs are also in the game. So how will it be possible for them to find off-takers, and how to deal with that? Do we need Other regulations? Do we need a third party? So that's the question. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you. Let's take 2 or 3 together. So I've got one question right here to the gentleman there, I think on the 4th row, and then we'll take one more and we'll hand it over.
My question has to do with the bankability of these projects, and it's evident that they need some kind of support for the risks that are being undertaken. And the only support I can foresee is coming from governments. So I'd like to know what it is do you expect governments to do specifically? What risk are they going to take in order to make a project bankable?
Brilliant. Thank you. And then if we can just pass it to the gentleman with the purple tie, I think, and then we can get going. So SMEs, what support do we need from governments? And then our last question for this round.
Thanks very much. My name's Constantine. I work for Nel Hydrogen. We're an electrolyzer manufacturer, the largest in the world. My question, I just want to carry on from the point that was made by the gentleman. He said, we only need electrolyzers. So if you take the EU's target for 2030, 20 million tons of renewable hydrogen, that means we need to go from 3 gigawatts of installed capacities today to around 300. And my question is twofold. Firstly, out of those 30 projects from the European Clean Hydrogen Alliance, 5 billion, how many of those are from electrolyzer manufacturers that want to scale up, that want to build new factories? And the second question is it time that electrolyzer manufacturers be afforded the same kind of funding mechanisms and tools that gas infrastructure, for example, were afforded over the last 10, 20, 30 years? Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. So SMEs, what government support can we get, and how do we get essentially electrolyzer manufacturers appropriately funded and supported to scale up? Who wants to take SMEs first? Let's go.
Perhaps I'll start with the gentleman from Nel on the question on the 30 projects. I would say about less than a handful of those were gigafactory type electrolyzer projects. So that hopefully answers your question. I can't comment on the types of public support or guarantees that should be made available because it was made available to other sectors. But certainly we're looking at these projects and how we can use our existing tools, or if they're not enough, if we need to recommend other support tools to support the deployment of these projects.
Brilliant. Thank you. Tonchi?
Maybe let me take the one on SMEs. In terms of the offtake, IFC, we have a group. I'm within the energy group. We also have a manufacturing group that has participation in 8 ammonia manufacturing plants around the world. Most of them the sponsors are first-class sponsors from Europe, the United States. So they're big manufacturers of ammonia, producers of ammonia. So that one of the ideas is to aggregate them, just like Germany is doing, aggregating the supply and the demand, working together with them to aggregate the purchase of green ammonia. Of my 10 hydrogen projects, 8 have as offtake fertilizer companies. Fertilizer companies want to show that they want to become green. And I always say, that hydrogen is a great energy carrier, but ammonia is a great hydrogen carrier. And right now, until we find out how to transport, how to store hydrogen, ammonia, green ammonia will be the play. And that's what we are seeing right now. And again, a lot of that demand is in-house, in the country. Another very important project that we have that I would like to use as an example, which is not fertilizers, is a multi-demand, multi-delivery node in a mining complex in northern Chile. Chile produces 40% of the copper in the world. You wouldn't believe the amount of diesel those copper trucks use. And so the idea is to run them with fuel cells. They are already running the forklifts with fuel cells. produce the hydrogen right there, because that's one of the best solar resources in the world next to the mines, and also produce ammonia for explosives. The explosives use ammonia, and use that same ammonia at the same place for producing fertilizers. So multi-demand, multi-delivery nodes at the same place. That's a beautiful project. So I think that's the idea. That's how I would prioritize, how I would select the projects initially. But also the example of Germany is an amazing. That's exactly what the doctor ordered, 10-year offtake guarantee by the German government. So I'm looking forward to collaborate with them. We are thinking about a window, a special window together with IFC within H2 Global for Africa and perhaps Latin America on how we can help that with that offtake and aggregate projects around the world.
That's beautiful.
Maybe I can address briefly the question on the role of government.
Fantastic.
Very, very briefly.
And then Lisa, you can do SMEs.
Yeah. Because I think you're making a very good point about the nature of the interventions from government. So what we see at the moment, there are a number of governments, institutions like the European Commission, for example, bilaterals, multilateral organizations, think about the GCF, that are looking into how to support green hydrogen. But we have to be very careful, because we see that the scale of the uptake needed requires a lot of finance. So we have to be very specific how we should use concessional instruments at what stage and for what purpose. For example, the use of guarantees instrument to support long-term offtake agreement. I think that's very smart use of potential public money. At EBRD, we are not necessarily so keen in using straight grant, because often they create an addiction into the market that is difficult to eradicate. And also we've seen in many markets that ultimately they don't really entail, or let's say a reduction in the cost of in the capex of the key component. So it's about really smart use of the limited ultimately funding available to cover some critical aspects of the bankability of projects. Again, go back to the point of offtake agreement is an important one. And perhaps also trying to identify what are the other enablers in the market. I talked about before investment in strengthening the grid's capacity to absorb more renewable energy and convey renewable energy to the users, and the electrolyzer. So perhaps this is another important way to help creating the conditions for investments to take place.
Brilliant, Lisa.
Yeah, perhaps just on the SME question, there's not that much I have to say, but other than obviously in general, SMEs are perhaps an entity that's a bit underrepresented in the global energy transition conversation. So I think it's really important you raise that. And I'm sure banks could come up with very clever aggregation mechanisms and capacity support mechanism to help that. But the main comment I wanted to make on this question is that when it comes to hydrogen, we should be following a demand-driven approach. So what we don't want to do is just offer and create loads of hydrogen supply where there is no offtake. So just in terms of the aggregation, et cetera, and helping SMEs come into the market, and on the production side, it's really important that that's actually triggered by demand somewhere rather than just sort of offered to the market. And that links to the point I wanted to make on support from governments. I mean, we heard about the Indian example this morning on targets for green hydrogen in fertilizer production. And that is the key offtake risk management policy tool, isn't it? Because that says, okay, we're going to get off using gas or whatever other input in the production process. We want to get to hydrogen this much by that time. That is a pretty strong signal to investors that there will be offtake. So I think we shouldn't forget about those policy tools, again, going back to the broader context here.
Brilliant, fantastic. So we're definitely running out of time a wee bit. I will take maybe 2 more questions from the audience. We've got one here from my Honorable Minister of Mines and Energy from Namibia. If I don't give him the floor, I'll be in trouble. And then, of course, right after him, we'll take your question, sir, and then we'll hand that over to the audience.
Thank you very much, James. You're already in trouble.
Perpetually.
I just want to ask from the DFI, when you do your risk assessment to fund a project or green hydrogen project, obviously there are probably three critical, either the production part of it, the technology, or the market, which is now the offtake. Where we are now, which worries you most? If you were just doing like, it must be produced, must be the technology, and obviously somebody has to use it. Where are we, where we think we need to do more, and that worries you more as potential funders? And Mr. Bakovic from IFC, you say you're going to go to Germany to get tons of money. I thought IFC has got tons and tons of money already. I don't know how is that possible that the IFC is still looking for money. But really, just to say, DFIs have to play a very, very important role in doing this, and therefore we need just to understand where are the risks more, so that we can start addressing those.
Brilliant, fantastic. Thank you, Honorable. If the mic could travel to our gentleman there with the blazer, maybe you can come to the mic, or we can meet each other halfway. There we go. Thank you.
Yeah, my name is Timo Balai from H2 Global. So Tonti, thanks so much for mentioning us all the time, because I just wanted to comment, first of all, really what we need is really need to develop a business case. That what H2 Global tries to achieve by taking out the market risk, the price risk, and the regulatory risk. So I think this is exactly what we're trying to aim for. Well, what I would also like to encourage the DFIs to bring in was also what you mentioned, blended finance. I believe there's ample of capital out there that is trying to channel into that market. And we need to create H2 as an asset class, as an institutional asset class for the institutional investors to jump in. And there, I really see a crucial role also of the DFIs to bring in and to set up structured vehicles with de-risking mechanisms that allow institutional investors to tap into that asset class. And then I believe we got the right combination, got a business case through initiatives like H2 Global, we got sort of de-risking mechanisms provided by the DFIs, and then I don't believe that we have to worry about capital not coming in. There's ample of capital around, it just needs to be channeled and utilized. So really I would like to encourage the DFIs to step in here and take that role.
Brilliant, fantastic. Look, I can't help but plug this particular statement. I think it's super crucial. So the 24th of May, 4 o'clock, the Namibian House in Davos, we're going to be launching a mechanism that is looking to address exactly what our colleagues at H2 Global are talking about. How can we aggregate blended financing in order to get a developer going, in order to get a country's strategy going, but in order to get the fuel to the off-takers? So I suppose we have really one key questions from our Honorable Minister. What are the key risks that you're all seeing that you would like us to be taking away from? And how can we help that as a group of people, whether it's developers, off-takers, or government? Toinchi, let's start with you. And perhaps to make sure we're managing time, one of the questions, the closing really question is, which one recommendation would you like to make to governments, industry, or the global green hydrogen community ahead of COP27 to make sure that we can scale up green hydrogen in time to curb climate change? So we can mix those two questions. The minister's question is the biggest risk, and then what is the recommendation you want us to make so that we get to COP27 with something a bit more tangible?
Let me see. And in terms of, supply and demand and what is the risk, right now I have projects in China, in India, that have 40% curtailment of renewables. My solar projects in the Atacama Desert for 4 years got zero marginal cost. The owners gave me the keys. We have serious transmission problems worldwide. People think that it's just scale up renewables and that's it, we're solved. No. My countryman, Nikola Tesla, wanted to transport electricity wirelessly, but he went bankrupt. He took JP Morgan bankrupt trying to do that. It is impossible. It's amazing the advancement we've seen in generation, even in retail with the digitization of retail, but the grid looks like 100 years ago. It's obsolete. And we have serious curtailment issues. China curtails more renewables than what California produces. And green hydrogen is a way to store that energy. Okay, it's very, very important. We have a serious grid issue and people need to understand. And that's when people say we should only take into account new green projects for green hydrogen, that worries me because I have right now projects that are curtailing, existing projects that are curtailing, they're spilling. Yeah. So that's number one. So supply, I think we have plenty of supply. The key challenge for me, that the demand is also there because I told you our fertilizer companies want to buy this green hydrogen, green ammonia. The key issue for me is the transport and the storage. And that's why we're going to have to do it first through green ammonia rather than green hydrogen. Now, in terms of money, Namibia sits at my board of directors. And their bylaws they gave me said, you shall go and lend money at commercial terms. Don't crowd out the private sector. And that's why what I'm trying to do is try to get donor money to blend my financing. So I can lend a little bit lower than commercial banks without crowding them out. So I can give a little push to these projects. IFC needs to behave like a private company. The World Bank is a different story, okay? But we work with the private sector, and in my opinion, it will be the private sector that makes this happen because they move fast, they are nimble, they take risks, they come up with amazing projects. And so, in my opinion, give the money to the private sector. I don't know if I've answered all. You had another
Yeah,
question?
I think the only one was, what can we do to COP27? But it sounds pretty good.
To COP27, I hope the message is loud and clear. I need help with electrolyzers.
Thank you, Toinchi. Gian Piero, your comment.
Very quickly. I think all the words of my colleague here resonate definitely with me. A couple of additional points. As I said already, the offtake side is a major risk, at least at this stage of development. What governments, or let's say public institutions, to do is also, though, to look more holistically at what are the options on the table, because it's very important to link green hydrogen to broader low carbon transition policies and strategies. If we invest in countries that then export green hydrogen or any other feedstock and then keep using inefficiently fossil fuel energy, I don't think we have necessarily made a progress with the climate challenge. So we have to understand how green hydrogen investments can be kind of connected and embedded in long-term decarbonization strategies in the country level. And finally, I think it's also important to bring everybody to the table. So there is no point to develop a green hydrogen strategy without the financial sector sitting at the table. I guess resonating also the words of the colleague from GH2 Global that intervened just a few minutes ago. The project developers and the regulator. So it's important that all the elements are taken into account.
Fantastic. Francois.
Just a fact. Can you hear me?
Go for it. Yeah, no, I think you.
Okay. Just a final thought on my end. I think the question was asked, where in the value chain sort of, is the most sensitive point. I mean, it's hard to pinpoint. It's hard to pinpoint, but it's actually a combination of things. And what I'm personally hoping, and this would be sort of my looking forward and also / recommendation, is that in parallel to all the quote unquote decentralized developments that we see happening that are all very welcome, but that are effectively still at a relatively small scale. If you look at sort of the map of all announced projects, you'll see a lot of 10, 20 type megawatt type projects. I'm personally hoping that there'll be, and we know there are, we know who they are. There'll be larger scale developments in a few very strategic / optimal locations that combine low cost access to low cost renewables, large scale industrial offtake, and relatively reasonable needs in terms of storage and transport. I'm hoping these projects will, develop quickly, that they'll engage early with us, that we'll hopefully be able to support them, and that they'll pave the way, they'll demonstrate the viability of green hydrogen at scale very quickly, and that will disrupt potentially the further development of the sector.
Fantastic, thank you. So Lisa, as we head to COP27, what are your recommendations?
Yeah, so I think if I have to pick one, I might use the second one as well, but I think really focus on where hydrogen can displace gas demand. I think in the current also price climate, that will help you very much with that business case that you're all looking for. That will help you with that offtake risk. I've already mentioned that. That will help you with strengthening your NDCs. That will help you mitigating CBAM risks and other sort of border tariffs that are being talked about in UK and the US. That also will help you circumvent transport and storage issues, which are still sort of being resolved. So just, I think in terms of really getting stuff going quickly and getting the biggest bang for your buck, I think that's what we over the next 6 months need to be looking at in terms of developing the hydrogen pipeline. And then if I may, sort of a second recommendation, I think it's really important that as sort of this green hydrogen community here, you team up with the renewables industry, you team up with the other energy solutions, clean energy solutions out there, rather than posing as competition in terms of finance. We will need more finance, and we need to put the right investments in the right place, rather than sort of acting as competition.
Fantastic. Ladies and gentlemen, we could probably talk about this until 4 o'clock, in which case we would just be kicked off the stage anyway. So I would really love to, thank you, audience, for engaging with the panel. And I think panel for sharing with us the pearls of wisdom that you have. So one of the things I think I'm hearing that was, if I could try and capture everyone's comments into one, is this multinodal demand offtake type projects, right? So make sure you're building an ecosystem that isn't too binary in its focus. And actually, that's possibly how we get the SMEs involved as well, is yes, we need hydrogen at scale to make it affordable, but these mines in Chile or any other big project, for example, would actually need to get the SMEs involved in one way or another. And that really, of course, really then helps uplift the local economy as well. I think fantastic insights from our panel. Please let's give him a hand of applause, and thanks everyone for joining us. Thank you.